You did everything right. You worked hard, followed the plan, and checked all the boxes. Maybe it was the career you poured yourself into. Maybe it was the relationship you built your world around. Or maybe it was the dream you chased for years. You sacrificed. You stayed up late, and you pushed through the hard times, believing that once you got there, wherever there was, it would all finally make sense. What happens when you wake up one day and the life you built, the one you worked so hard for, feels foreign, like it belongs to someone else? That's a grief no one prepares you for. Because grief isn't just about losing a person. It's about losing an identity. It's about losing a future, a version of yourself you thought you were supposed to be. It's mourning the years you spent believing in something that no longer fits. And even when you know, deep down, that it's time to move on, letting go can feel unbearable, because who you are without this thing you built. Here's what I want you to know. You are not lost. You are becoming. And letting go of an old life isn't failure. It's evolution. It's growth. It's the soul whispering, there is something more for you. And yes, stepping into the unknown is terrifying. Yes, it feels like free-falling. But what if, on the other side of that grief, there's a life that feels lighter, a life that actually fits who you are now, and not where you were when you started this journey?
So grief can be painful or it can be ecstatic, depending upon how you approach it. And one of the things that happens when you open to receive the love finally is that it squeezes out some of the grief. And so you find yourself crying every time you feel loved. And for me, that process took like 2 years for me to clear the grief before I could stop crying every time I felt loved.
Our guest is a force of nature, equal parts mystic, mentor, and truth teller. From an early childhood, marked by psychic sensitivity, emotional chaos, and constant change, she emerged as a guide for others walking the edge between the spiritual and the everyday. Her journey wasn't easy, navigating deep grief, burnout, and a breakdown of identity. But through it all, she kept following the call, and today she is known for her ability to help others move through their awakenings with clarity, grace, and power. Welcome back. You are listening to the Urban Grief Shamans, and I'm your host, John Moyer.
The grief in the world is serving a purpose right now, just like COVID served a purpose. It put everybody into forced hermitage where they had to be with themselves. It was part of the collective awakening. The grief is there right now. We're doing a collective energy shift. And the very first thing that happens is the ego screams up and tries to defend itself. And that's what we're seeing in the world right now.
This is our guest, Kelly Sparta. Kelly is a masterful guide who brings insight, deep compassion, and an unshakable presence into every conversation. She's a transformational shaman, a psychic, and a teacher. Let's jump in. Kelly, can you go back in 1998 where you kind of packed up and left everything? There must have been something more going on with you. We just don't all of a sudden blossom into our spirituality. There's usually a long process before we get there.
Yes.
So could you take us back as far as you're comfortable? Tell me about your childhood. Just what kind of a young girl were you? What was your family life like?
Yes. My mother said I was talking to ghosts in my crib. And so my mom had been psychic when she was a child and had been scared of it. And so she shut it down. And she was absolutely dedicated to the idea that I would not have that same problem, that I would understand it and be able to utilize it and all that other stuff. My dad, on the other hand, was highly logical. And so they were both teachers. Mom was an English teacher. Dad was a math teacher. And she was the emotional. He was the logical. And they really did not get each other, right? I'd say. Because shortly after I came in, they were done. And that was a whole thing. But mom was also an alcoholic and dad was a rageaholic. And so the two together were quite entertaining. And so when they split when I was 5, my mother went deep into a personal growth journey and proceeded to bring home things like S. And we would study Seth and Ram Dass and Abraham Hicks and J.C. Knight and all of that. Sadly, she never really did manage to find her happiness before she passed away. But all of the stuff that she raised me with was super helpful for me. And my dad was also psychic, but would never admit to it. He always just said, "Oh, I just read people. I just understand people." And I'm like, yeah, you are quote unquote understanding things you have no way of knowing, right? Let's do the math. He would never admit it. He always thought I was just a little off my nut. And it was so funny at his funeral, a couple came up to me who had known my parents when they were still together when I was like 4 or 5 years old. And they said, "We remember your mother. She was a freak spirit," which is Southern for crackpot, right? I'm like, yes, she was. Okay. My mother was always a little off, and in fun ways and not so fun ways, but she was a little off. Mom was my best friend. We moved a lot as a child. So my entire life was spent losing friends and trying to find new ones because we moved every year or two. I learned how to reflect the energy in the room, learned how to fit in quickly. It is my superpower.
If I can just take it back to when your parents split, it's obviously he was really the first male that you loved, right? And now that's leaving, or he's leaving. So what was that like for you that time?
Well, it was a split thing for me because my dad terrified me. When he got angry, I have memories of hiding in a closet and pulling all the coats down on top of me to try and get away from the energy of him screaming at my mother while she ignored him by reading. And so he was never physically abusive, but the verbal abuse and the energy of the anger was significant for my poor little empath self. And so I was scared of him until I was in my 30s. And so when they split, it was a gift because I got a break from that. And I would only see him for 2 weeks out of the year. And yeah, he did the normal dad things. I have pictures of him doing normal dad things. Not bad things, but dad things. But I have no memory of him doing. I don't have any memories from the inside of that house. I only have memories from the outside of the house. And I have lots of memories from the house down the street. So that tells you, and the house across the street. So it tells you that there was stuff that I was trying not to remember, right?
Yeah, for safety.
Yeah.
How did that affect your relationships at all as you're growing up into
big time.
Teenage years?
Big time. I picked men who were emotionally unavailable and or physically absent. My first husband was a classic example of both. So he was a submariner. So he would go out to sea for 3 months at a shot. And he was not emotionally available at all. And my father, ironically, looked at me and said, I give it 3 months when he met him after we eloped. That the only time he ever said he was proud of me was when I told him I was getting a divorce. And he said, you give it, I can't say you didn't try. I'm proud of you. I'm like, I did it to freaking spite you, stupid butthead. I was just like, are you kidding me? So I'm like, no, this is not good for me. I was doing a lot of work on myself at the time. And you asked what was leading up to the divorce and the chucking my whole life. My entire childhood, I had wanted to be Auntie Mame without the alcohol. Mame Dennis was an amazing person, but she was a free spirit. She wanted to see the world. She wanted to talk to free thinkers. She wanted to be creative and all of these things. And it often came with alcohol because it was the 60s. Because of my mother's alcoholism, I wanted it without the alcohol, right? I did manage to have that life after I divorced my husband, but I followed the American Dream checklist in my 20s. I married the third person who asked me, which I thought was being responsible, but I was still only 21. For one, we really didn't have any common values. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
And I stepped away from my spirituality for that time. And after a while, I just was like, you know what? This is not working for me. I was getting certified in a program from Mind Empowerment International. And I went to this event, and this guy who was running the event said, my hands just turned on. Somebody in the room needs healing. And there were only a couple of us there. It was a very high ticket thing. And
Mhm.
and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? Now, I've been a healer my whole life, and I had never heard of energy healing, which was so weird. But I studied, when my mom got her nurse's license after the divorce, I was her study buddy. So I've got all of Grey's Anatomy in the back of my head. And he said, can I do some work on you? And so he came to the hotel room later that night and did some work with me, doing some energy release and some healing work and going into my heart. And he was like, okay, tell me how your heart feels. And I was like, I got nothing. He's like, okay, let's just go down some stairs, open the door. What's it look like? The walls are black and dripping. And he's like, why? And I said, my husband. And he's like, okay, so this is interesting. I had been trying to get my husband to go to counseling for years, like 4 or 5 years. And I had been slowly adding in you don't want to get a divorce, do you? I don't want to get a divorce. Do you want to get a divorce? He's no. And I'm like, we need to fix this. This is not going away by itself. He just was not willing to do it. All of that had built up, and that brought me to super clarity. And that weekend I came home and I asked for a divorce. And he immediately said, I'll go to counseling. And I said, too little, too late. And I said, if it had gone before, then it was because you cared that I wasn't happy. And now it's because you don't want to be divorced. And that's not good enough.
Was it a very unhappy time for you at that point?
Oh, I was really miserable. I mean, I had started, so we moved to Connecticut in 1993, and I got my real estate license almost immediately thereafter. 93? Yeah, 93. And the first year in business, now I didn't know anybody. So you can understand how hard I was working. When I tell you I sold 25 houses in a year, I was working 100-hour work weeks, working. And I would come home to him bitching at me because I had not cleaned the house. And I'm like, I'm working 100-hour work week. You're working 40. Why am I cleaning the house? And I was like, fine. So I hired a housekeeper. And then he wasn't happy with that because evidently in his love language, cleaning the house was love language. And we didn't have the consciousness to be able to understand that for years after that initial conversation. And so I had burned out basically my first year in the business. And so I was working in an industry that I was fried in. I was working way too many hours. I was in this cold war with my husband. And it was just, I should have divorced him within 3 months, but it just wasn't my people in that area for the most part. Unlike, I live in Boquete, Panama now, and almost everybody I meet here is my people, which is it's just a different dynamic, different place, right? So yeah, I was pretty miserable. And so there was a lot of buildup on that. And the anxiety was insane. Oh my God. I would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat going, oh my God, I forgot these 6 things. And I literally kept a pad of paper next to my bed so I could write down all the things that I'd forgotten from the day, because the anxiety was insanely high and I was having a hard time keeping up with everything because I had too many moving parts and not enough help. And I didn't know exactly what I was doing. So I was trying to figure it out as I went. And the further along I got, the more I did a lot of bridge burning in the beginning because I was so strung out that I was constantly yelling at people. Can't burn your bridges in real estate. I did recover from it eventually, but got called the force of nature a lot, which was a kind way of saying a raving lunatic bitch. But yes. Yeah, because I was miserable and I was stressed out and I was angry and I was upset and all the things. So I was doing what I could on myself, but I didn't have the bandwidth and the distance to be able to do enough. And you got to be met halfway in the relationship. He just wasn't meeting me at all.
Yeah. So is that because most people's spiritual awakenings are triggered by some kind of a loss? And are we framing, in a sense, your loss as a change of who you were, being a married woman and working all these hours to finally having to make some big changes? You're being pushed to make change now.
Yeah, it was a cascade of things, right? The aha moment was that moment of the healing space, but there was just so much going on at once that it just landed on my head, right? Later in the process, I did hire an assistant, and I had pulled myself out of my business enough that I was really only working 18 or 20 hours a week and letting her do everything else. And I instead was spending 40 to 60 hours a week running a Habitat for Humanity affiliate that was in crisis and was like on the verge of shutting down because it lost all its funding and all of the volunteers were quitting. I took over a nightmare. I took it over that way and then ended up doing a lot of work around that. But it was this process of just everything just built up.
Your mother had a lot of influence in forming a foundation for you.
Yeah. We were the dynamic duo, right? So it was her and me against the world, the whole Helen Reddy song, right? That was our theme song. And so she was there. She was emotionally 5 years old my whole life, but she kept the lights on and made sure that I got what I needed. We were constantly listening to stuff, and she sent me to psychic development classes. I only had like two significant spiritual experiences in my childhood outside of her saying I was talking to ghosts in my crib. So one was a ghost that showed up at the foot of my bed in California that looked like a prospector. And when I noticed him and freaked out, I was like, he disappeared from the waist up, which was freaky, right? Another time was a boyfriend and I, who I'd met in Hawaii when we were on vacation, had been practicing talking to me from Hawaii. And I heard his voice right next to my ear, woke me up out of a dead sleep, him calling my name. And I checked in with him and he's like, yeah, that was me. And then younger, because those were both in my mid-teens, like 16. Earlier in middle school, I had been, and this one's a little darker, but I had been in a church youth group and we were playing in the catacombs in the dark. And this kid had a demon in him, and the demon came for me. And in the church catacombs, I'm like, how did you get onto sacred ground? I don't understand. So the ground was clearly not sacred, but came at me, and that was problematic. So those were really the only spiritual things in my childhood that showed up. But everything exploded open when I divorced my husband, and it's actually the divorce that really exploded it, because I didn't move out of state. I didn't quit and sell my job, sell my business rather, and quit the nonprofit until like a year later. But the spiritual stuff just exploded onto the scene, because when I sold the house, I bought another house and it had a ghost on the property. And I started taking Reiki classes, and I started taking shiatsu classes, and all of this synchronicity opened up. I stepped into this state of profound gratitude about my life. Everything was just like, oh, I don't have to check in with him before I do something or buy something or, whatever. And I was just in this beautiful state of profound gratitude. And that just opened up all of these psychic skills for me, to the point where I was getting guidance that I needed to go. I remember I was going to go to a spiritualist church event, service, and I was going to be late. And I'm like, I'm late. Maybe I just won't go. And the voice came into my head very clearly. You have to go. She won't be there next week. And I'm like, okay. So I went, and I'm at the coffee klatch afterwards. And this woman who is a regular introduces me to her mother. And I'm like, oh, hi, blah, blah, blah. And she starts talking, and I'm like, oh, you're the reason I had to come. And she's like, what? I said, and I told her what had happened. And she's like, you're the sign I asked for. I'm like, okay. So but things like that happened a lot that year. It was huge. And it was the year so I was doing the spiritualist church, and they do mediumship from the pulpit there. And I would always get something extra, right? And I would go find the people at the coffee klatch and say, hey, when you got this message, I was also getting this. And so one day, one of the guys who I used to hang out with and had done this to multiple times, said, hey, I run this class every month, I think. And the teacher backed out last second. And would you be willing to come and teach a class for 2 hours? And he's like, anything you want. And I was like, well, I'm taking a shiatsu class, so I can teach what I know about that. And he's like, great. And after an hour and a half, I had run out of everything I knew about shiatsu. So I was like, and he's like, well, why don't you just do readings for everybody? Now, I'd been reading tarot cards since I was 12. So if I'd had my cards with me, I would have been like, yeah, that's fine. I'll do that. But I had nothing with me. And I was like, oh, I don't do that. He's like, you do that every week at church. I'm like, oh, no, I don't do this. And I finally agreed to do it with the understanding that everything I said was probably wrong. Because all of these people were brand new to me. I had no way of knowing anything about them except whatever they might have said in the middle of the class that I was teaching, which wasn't much, right? And I remember to this day, every single reading I did for the people in that room, because it was the moment I proved to myself that I was psychic. And I scared myself. I was like, I have no way of knowing these things. And I'm looking for things like, one guy's dressed like an executive with, the boat shoes and no socks and the khakis. This was the 90s, right? And he's dressed like some sort of corporate executive on vacation. And I'm like, you paint for a living. And he's like, yeah, I'm a house painter. And I'm like, oh my God, right? And I'm looking for little dots of paint on his clothes, on his shoes, on anything. I'm like, why would I have known that? It was a pivotal moment in my life. And it was a function of just being grateful for being done with that marriage that I had been stuck in for so long. I also had to go through the grieving process for that marriage, to grieve the dream of what might have been, the dream of what you wanted it to be. And I did do that. But I also spent a huge amount of time in gratitude for being done.
Well, the idea of grief as a catalyst for spiritual growth. Many people think that you have to endure grief as something that you have to go through. You work with transformation. You work with all these people. And so how do you see grief as a gateway to personal power, for example?
So grief can be painful or it can be ecstatic, depending upon how you approach it. And so I'm going to tell you a story. I was at an event in Harbin Hot Springs years ago, and I was having an experience over and over again of how I was just feeling unwelcome over and over and over again. I mean, I was staying in a dorm, and this woman kept waking me up in the middle of the night because I'd been crying all weekend in the workshop. And so I was snoring, and she woke me up, and I tried, I blew my nose, and I tried to wait for her to go back to sleep, good co-sleeper. And I waited 15 minutes and went back to sleep. And I had already separated myself from everybody else and put myself on the bottom while they were up in the top to try and account for that. And she came and woke me up again and said, you're going to have to leave. Like telling me in the middle of the night, get out of my bed and leave, because she was being disrupted, which, not okay, which I told her. I was like, no. And then I went, and a group of us so there's Harbin Hot Spring people who live there, and then there's the people at the workshop. And a group of people from the workshop were in the sauna. And one of the people who live there is like sticking her head in and going, you guys done? No, we're not going to be done for a while. If you'd like to come in and sit, you're welcome to join us. And she's like, no, I'll wait. And she closed the door, and 10 minutes later opens it. Are you done yet? It's like, no, it's just like over and over again, right? It was the theme, right? And that just kept happening. And so I'm at breakfast. I go to breakfast, and there's a group of people at the table. They've all been laughing and having a good time and getting dirty looks from everybody around them, because it's a quiet space in Harbin usually. And so I show up, and I'm sitting there, and I was late to breakfast, so they all got up and left. And I'm sitting there by myself, still getting the dirty looks from people. And I'm like, I'm freaking by myself. What is your point? They're still giving me dirty looks. And I'm sitting there with my oatmeal, and I'm eating my oatmeal, and I'm saying, I have never felt so unwelcome in my entire life. And in that moment, I realized I have always felt this unwelcome my whole life, because I'd been the military brat who was constantly moving. Because of everything in my life, I was just like, I felt unwelcome. And, my father got remarried, and my stepmother did her best, but the kids didn't want me there. So there was unwelcome there too. And so it was just, I had all of that grief inside of me. And I started to cry into my oatmeal. And I was like, oh, this has been true. And it was unconscious up until that moment. The universe was speaking to me over and over again throughout that entire event, so that I would recognize it. I would wake up to it, become aware of it, because until you're aware of something, you can't shift it. Right. And so what was so beautiful about this is that I went from there to the actual hot springs, still in tears and just crying to myself and just pulling out all this grief and releasing it into the water. And this couple came up to me in the hot spring and they said, "Would you like to be floated?" And I was like, yes, I would love that. So the universe sent me someone to literally hold me while I released the grief, right? Because once you engage it, once you accept it, once you are with it and you can allow it to release from you, it is a hugely opening space, and it allows you to accept the support that can come from that, right? There's a lot of different ways we experience grief in our lives. And, one of the things I talk to my people about all the time is the fact that when you are in a space where you don't feel like receiving love is safe, you will stop receiving love because it either comes with an obligation or, it's just not safe to receive it. So you stop receiving it, and then it creates this internal belief structure because your internal self, your inner child, doesn't realize that you made that choice. And so it creates a story that says, I'm unlovable. And that creates massive amounts of grief. And every time you don't receive love, you get more and more sad. And so one of the things, because we do work on opening the heart and opening to receive, and one of the things that happens when you open to receive the love finally is that it squeezes out some of the grief. And so you find yourself crying every time you feel loved. And for me, that process took like 2 years for me to clear the grief before I could stop crying every time I felt loved. And it still showed up every so often, but it was on a larger scale. So like Encanto, I watched Encanto, the movie, and where Mirabelle doesn't get noticed by anyone and her contributions are not valued. And finally, they all recognize her contributions and honor them. I bawled my eyes out. Okay. Because that was all that grief from my life coming out. And, the grief is a wave, right? It just comes in waves. It's not a one and done thing like a lot of other things. It comes to you in waves and it has to be sat with. And you have to let it be what it is. If you stuff it, it can get stuck. And so when it shows up, you just have to have your sadness and your tears. And there it is. Another very strange story of the universe supporting you in a way that most people wouldn't be okay with. I was sad about a relationship that didn't go well. I was on my way to my therapist's office. I was still grieving the loss of my mother. So it was back in 2010. And I was just feeling sad on the subway. And so I was just letting the tears come and I was just being sad. And the tears were gone, but I was still deep in my grief when I came out of the subway. And in Central Square in Boston, there is a group of people who sit around and drink all day, right? And I did not know this guy was part of that group. He looked, he had a bomber jacket on. He looked like he had the military veteran thing going on. And, my mother was military, so I feel comfortable with military. And, an older man. And he walked up to me and he said, "You are too beautiful to be so sad." And he kissed me right on the lips. And not, very chaste kiss, but a kiss. And I was just like, it was like the universe saying it's okay, right? And then I caught the smell of alcohol on his breath and then he wandered off. It was like, okay, so that was the universe saying you're going to be okay and we've got your back and, all of this stuff. And so, when you let the grief out, the universe finds really interesting ways to support you.
Oh, for sure. I want to just ask you a question about that sense of not belonging or not wanted.
Yeah.
And I was wondering that your parents must have had a lot of grief when they were younger as well. I mean, I can't imagine going into the military life is easy in any way. So to want to go that way, for one thing, I would think, well, there must be something there that you're chasing your own demons, like you need the discipline, you need all these distractions. And the same thing for the rage that your father had must have been just something terrible that's being either passed down from his father or his grandfather to his father. But at the end of the day, when they decided to either have a child or unplanned, that perhaps it was when you're in uterine, those feelings of not wanting this child, I can't be pregnant now. Do you think any of that played a role in your feeling not wanted?
My mother desperately wanted me. She taught, she's told me that she spent years talking my dad into having a kid. My dad did not want children. At least that's her story. He married a woman who had children, so who knows, right? But, he also encouraged me if I didn't want to have kids not to. So, but my dad was, I'm pretty sure that what it was down to is that it was my dad was desperately afraid of being a terrible father,
Hmm.
because his father had been a terrible father. And, so much so that his sister ended up in mental institutions over and over again. So the, he never talked about the stuff. He hinted at it, but he would never talk about it. But he
Hmm.
was very clear that he and my grandfather did not get along, and it was not, his childhood was not okay. I've talked to my cousins about it, his sister's children, and they've all said, yeah, it was really bad, but they never gave me details, and that's
Yeah.
okay. I don't need them, right? But my mother also, her father died when I was still a baby, and she never got over that loss. I mean, she was daddy's little girl, and she spoke of him like he was some sort of knight in shining armor, beautiful, wonderful human. And to be fair, other people spoke about him that way too. For my mother, it was my grandmother who was the problem. She,
Mm.
at my grandmother's funeral, she said, "I'll never tell you the things that woman put me through." And I'm like, okay. So I was definitely a planned pregnancy. My aunt on my mother's side was definitely not a planned pregnancy, but my mother was, is my understanding. So, I don't think it was that so much. I just think there was a lot of rage and whatnot. But you're looking for the where did the not welcome story comes in, which is kind of interesting because my birth story has a little bit of that in it. Because my mother had an obstetrician who I was going to be his last baby, and she was committed to him delivering me. And so she had them drug her to put off the delivery until he could arrive. So much so that she was so hopped up on drugs that she said the minute she saw me, she was like, "Oh, good," and then passed out. And she actually was of the opinion that I was a twin. They had actually said I was going to be a twin. And twin baby boys, small twin baby boys is what I'd been predicted to be. And he never predicted. And I was 8 pounds, 7 ounces, baby girl, solo child, right? But she was convinced that there was another twin and that had been stillborn and born, and she didn't remember it, and that they just never told her about it because they knew that it would make her sad. And I'm like,
Mm.
okay, but 2 babies with one at 8 pounds, 7 ounces is not very reasonable. I don't think so, Mom, but Mom was a little off.
Kelly, moving on just a little bit, in your material, you talk about training 100,000 spiritual warriors, not that you call them that, but people who are here to elevate the planet.
Yeah.
Do you see that grief is something that many of these people have to move through in order for them to step into their work?
Most people don't come into the spiritual world without some form of childhood trauma of some kind. The vast majority of people in the spiritual world have something that they're dealing with. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. When I'm working with the 100,000, what I'm doing is I'm helping them to move through their limiting beliefs and the healing that they need to do in order to be able to step fully into their authentic selves and fully into the work in the world. And like I said, the vast majority of people have to work with some version of opening their heart. And so that always has grief associated with it. If you had it shut down, there's always grief there. A lot of people do have actual grief that they're processing from, meaning what more normal people think of as grief, meaning they had a loss of a loved one or some major trauma or some massive loss in their life. Some of them will have mediumship. They're getting messages from the beyond, from the person who crossed over, or whatever, right? There's all kinds of things that go on. I get tons and tons of people at different stages. Interestingly, in the last 4 years, ever since COVID, people who are waking up much further along on their journey. And so what they're, instead of just going, "Oh, I kind of would like to talk to my guides," or, "I'd like to talk to my angels." Now it's, I'm having prophetic dreams. Things are coming at me. I'm being told I can't come to some spiritual practitioners because too many entities are coming with me, and I feel under attack, or I'm seeing things that I don't understand. I don't have context or language for it. And so I'm getting that a lot more. And so, this is why I've been working with these people specifically, is because it's terrifying to come into something and not have any sense of language for it, and everybody around you is like, are you sure you're not schizophrenic? Are you sure you haven't gone around the
Hmm.
bend in some way? Because you're delusional, right? And it's like, you're not delusional. You've just come into your gifts.
Yeah.
And, you need somebody who speaks the language well enough to be able to validate and to be able to see what you're doing. So I had a shaman friend years ago who used to work at a psych ward. And he said about a third of the people who were in the psych ward were actually psychic. He said they weren't delusional. They were actually seeing things that were actually there. And he would go in and clear them for them. Like, one guy would scream because something would be in his room at night. And he'd say, look, I'll get rid of it, but you can't tell anybody I did it. And he's like, okay, that's a deal. And so he would get rid of whatever the thing, these things happen. And
Yeah.
if they're not understood, people are concerned. They're like, I don't want to open my mouth. I could get institutionalized, right? Or if they're high end in business or in publicity and they don't want to be seen as being nuts, but they
Hmm.
need
Hmm.
help. And so that's the work I do.
Well, I'm thinking that there's a deep collective grief in the world right now.
Oh, so much.
How do you see spiritual practitioners and shamans hold space for that kind of vast societal grief?
So from my end, because I can't speak for other spiritual practitioners or teachers, but from my end, what I'm doing is I am being with what is, right? Because grief is a beingness state. When we do our spiritual work, we have the masculine path, which is the doingness state of stripping away until you become nothing and you become one with everything. And then you have the beingness state, which is accepting, receiving without judgment, all that is until you become everything and you become one with everything. And the goal of full enlightenment is to do both at the same time and have it not be a paradox, right? Well, grief operates within that feminine path. It operates within that beingness state. You can only be with grief to allow it to process through you. When we're living in this collective grief state around the breakdown of everything, it's about being with it and allowing it to process through you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most people aren't doing that kind of work. I did a sound healing for clearing grief back in 2020 when everybody was dying. I gave it away. It was like, anybody who wants it, here you go. And I've been consistently giving that away for years now because it works. Every time somebody uses it, it clears a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And so one of the interesting things is that every time you clear your own grief, you're also clearing the grief of the world because your grief is part of that collective unconscious. Within your own grieving process, you will be also processing part of that collective grief as well, because you are part of that collective grief, right? The more people wake up, and I am seeing people wake up at a much faster pace than ever before. The more I see them wake up, the more grief they are dealing with. And the more you can get people to be with their feelings, the more the world shifts. And I think somebody said that you only need 3% of the population to change the world. And I'm like, okay, 3% is what we're shooting for, right? So we've got 100,000 people on the planet whose job it is to help facilitate that. I leverage my value to the community by helping those people so that they can be more effective, be more powerful, be more in their moment, be more seen, be everything, right? The grief in the world right now, there's a point you hit when you're doing this work for long enough where you recognize that some things are meant to be there and some things are meant to be changed. And the grief in the world is serving a purpose right now, just like COVID served a purpose. It put everybody into forced hermitage where they had to be with themselves. It was part of the collective awakening. The grief is there right now. So it's almost like we're doing a collective energy shift. It's all about the identity shift. The shamanic death is what they call it. And the very first thing that happens is the ego screams up and tries to defend itself. And that's what we're seeing in the world right now. We're seeing the ego screaming up and trying to defend itself. But it already knows it's lost because it wouldn't be screaming up if it didn't know it was lost. And at the same time, this grief of letting go of the self that used to be, right? And when I say self in this case, I'm not talking about individual selves. I'm talking about the collective self, right? The
Okay.
collective identity. And as that comes through, that grieving process is appropriate. And in fact, when we do shamanic death work, we will often do a funeral rite for the former self. And, to really acknowledge that this is something that has happened and to put it to rest specifically.
Is that considered like a ritual?
Yes, absolutely. We'll do a ritual around it. And there's no collective ritual right now for what's happening on the planet. And so the grief is going to need to be processed somehow. I've got the Clearing Grief audio. If you are finding that that's showing up in your life, I will give you a link to get people
Sure.
a copy of it, because it is helpful, and you can do it for yourself or you can do it for the planet. It's up to you, because there is no way of it happening in other ways other than through people's individual grieving of other things, where it'll come out around the edges for that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually making grieving more heavy lifting for the people who are grieving for other reasons right now.
There are big misconceptions about healing grief. I know healing's not even the really right word, right? Because nothing's broken. It's just, It's a process that for us to be well, what's the word? The larger capacity to love, the larger capacity for compassion.
Yeah.
Grieving is the part that makes us most human.
Yes.
So it's nothing that needs to be repaired, but it's to understand the fact that it's not a pleasant place to be in, especially at the beginning of a deep grief, when there's a deep loss and whatever that may be. But when you get past that point, if you have the courage to still engage your grief, and that's what's really needed, is, I think, to process the beginning of that change, is to now step forward and start tending to those feelings of grief. That's where the transformation or the metamorphosis starts to take place.
Yeah.
Have you ever come across any big misconceptions amongst the people that you're training?
Well, so first thing is, people don't know about grief brain. Grief brain is real. You literally have a hard time thinking when you're deep in grief. You get brain fog. Your brain just won't land on anything. You have a hard time grounding, right? And especially if you are an empath and the person that passed, and I'm going to talk about it as a person that passed in this scenario, was close to you. Oftentimes you've shared your energy field with them, and they've taken part of your energy field to the other side and left part of themselves with you. This is the reason why so many couples who have been together a long time will pass within a month of each other. It's because they take part of the person to the other side, because they're jointly sharing their energy. And so half of them has died already. And so they pass over to balance it out. And so grief brain is significant, right? So you have a hard time remembering things. You have a hard time keeping track of things. It's you're ungrounded is really what it comes down to, is that you've found ways to connect into the world, and one of your ways is gone, right? And so you're just wandering. And so
makes us feel powerless, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah, that too. There's always that sense of powerlessness as well. And that can really shake your sense of self, especially if your identity is based in the idea that you're a powerful person. When something like that happens that you have no control over, it can really challenge your sense of self. And so that's issue number one. Number two is, and this isn't just about grief, but it's about all emotions. When your heart is shut down, right? When you've shut it down, you don't feel your emotions. You manage your emotions with your head, right? You rationalize your emotions, and you try to rationalize them away. And because of that, you're not actually processing them. You're just stuffing them. And so when you start to feel for the first time after that, and usually in that case, the only thing you're feeling is anger or sadness. And that's it. Those are the only emotions to get through when you've shut everything down. And so anger just doesn't help, because the more you let it out, the more you yell about it, the more upset you get about it, and it just amps itself up, right? But and sadness goes into depression very quickly, because you turn it inward, and then now you're just depressed. So both of those are not helpful. And so the big fear is that when I start to feel something, I'm going to have to feel everything, and it's going to overwhelm me. And to a certain extent, when you start to feel, yes, the other feelings will come out, not generally all at once. Okay. So they do come out, and they'll come out weirdly, and you'll be like, what is this? I'm feeling this weird way and I don't have any reason to. Right. Because you stuffed it like 30 years ago and now it's showing up now. So stop looking for a reason, just have the emotion and let it go. Right. That's the thing that happens when people, because grief can sometimes break through that locked up place for the heart. And so they're afraid of the overwhelm of emotions because they've been stuffing them for so long. They know that there's so much in there. It's, even if it's subconsciously, they're like, oh, I can't do this, right? But it generally is not like that.
If they don't, the body is even going to, get into the act. That's where we start developing illnesses or diseases because the body it needs to get rid of that energy.
Yeah. Betta Vanderkolk wrote the book, Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
I heard the title, but just know that a lot of the energy that we hold, that it's not our energy, and it needs to be clear. But the people that you're working with, how do you help them to reclaim their personal power?
So that, again, is a process. The first thing we have to do is find mental, emotional, and energetic safety, because until you feel safe, you don't have the bandwidth to grow. And so that's going to be shutting up the monkey mind and getting your energy field solid and not having other people inside your energy field, which is what the definition of an empath is, right? Is you're shoving your energy field out to the point where other people are inside of your field. Then setting up some protections for your energy field, for your home, just so that you feel safe. And then we work on fear and anxiety and worry and dread and self-doubt and inner and outer judgment. And we build a foundation of self-support and courage. And that gives you the mental, emotional, and energetic safety piece. And then from there, to get to being able to hold your power, you then have to learn how to claim your space in the world. It's okay for you to take up space. You have to set your boundaries. It's okay to tell people no and to claim that, to say, you stay there, I'm going to be here. And then own your power, which is being able to give yourself permission to have it. Because in a lot of cases, we've not allowed ourselves that, either because we were killed in a past life for our gifts, or because we were, we know that we have a well of rage. And so because we have the well of rage, we won't give ourselves too much power, because we might lay waste to the world with too much power. And so you have to empty that well of rage to be able to get to that power and give yourself permission to have it. We might not be a good person because of the well of rage. You have to get past that. We have to work on issues around being able to, are we responsible for what we see? And what do we have to do with that? And am I willing to be responsible? What am I willing to see? And all of those things show up in those places. And then there's the point of being able to internalize your sense of value so that you're not looking for validation outside of yourself all the time. And you're able to stand solidly in your own space and not have to justify your value. And then ultimately learn how to love yourself, right? And all of those pieces together, when you combine them, solidify your energetic container and your sense of self, your identity. And in doing that, when you can solidly hold yourself, now you can solidly hold your power to be able to do what is the true shadow work that we have to do to heal ourselves, which is the self-inquiry process and diving deeper into the stories and the belief structures and things like that help us to release all of the rest of it.
Thank you for joining us today for this powerful conversation with Kelly Sparta. Her grief awakening and reclamation journey reminds us that healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to who we have always been. If Kelly's words move something in you, take a moment to sit with it. Let it settle. Let it guide you. Until next time, take gentle care, and remember, your power is waiting for you on the other side of your truth.